Ladies and gentlemen, I think we would like to begin. Since you all came, I can see, with your best friend, your best mate, your colleague from work, or you came because you're a friend and fan of the person here tonight, but we're all here together to enjoy the evening. So welcome, good people of London, welcome, friends and fellow travellers. I'm Lyse Doucet of the BBC, joining all of you tonight to celebrate the life and times of Emma Skye. And what a life and times it has been. And it's only just begun. I sometimes think names can be destiny, and I've always been fascinated by Emma's last name, Skye. You know, you think sky full of stars, blue skies, horizons, and of course she's been very much true to her destiny. Some of you will be familiar with Emma's first book, The Unraveling. It is a book, and I will quote her here, how she described it. The anti-war Brit who went to Iraq to apologize for the invasion. That must be in the Guinness World Book of Record for the most long-distance apology ever. Received no briefing before leaving the UK, was put in charge of an Iraqi province, and narrowly escaped death in the first month. Emma also went on to become a leading advisor to the top US military commanders in Iraq. But she's here tonight, and I'm sure some of you may have questions about that time of her life, but we're here tonight essentially to talk about her new book. In a time of monsters, travels through a Middle East in revolt. And I have to proudly say that in case you haven't, I'm going to give you a little secret to entice you to buy the book. The book is dedicated for fellow travelers. So it's for all of us. The book is dedicated to us. Thank you very much, Emma. And the title, some of you may know, it's quoting one of the people that I love to quote and didn't know that this one was his. And you hear it quoted a lot in the Middle East. The old world is dying, and the new world struggles to be born. Now is the time of monsters. The Italian Marxist Antonio Gramsci. And I think in broad brush strokes, this is a book which takes us, Emma takes us, through the Middle East, through Central Asia, across Europe on the 2015 migration trail, and we come back and forth to London. But all the time, there is the thread of Iraq, the resonance of Iraq in Emma's life, and she continues to go back again and again to Iraq. But there's another big question, too, which gets posed time and again. And it's perhaps a question that many of you here tonight from different walks of life pose is, what is it all for? What is our purpose? If you're a writer, a diplomat, a soldier, what was it about? Was it worth it, we say in my profession? And we want to deal with that, Emma, because it's a very important question. But thank you so much for getting off the road and coming to sit with us at least for a while here. And as we begin, we should begin with, well, how we should always begin, with Bob Dylan. Does someone have a better voice than me? You can sing the song. How does it feel? Who can sing it? How does it feel to be on your own with no direction? You guys are useless. With no direction home, a complete unknown. I was very taken by your beginning of the book. It's a very honest account. It is September 2010. You come back to your flat in London. What was the feeling?
Lyse, when I opened the door of my flat and it was all dark, musty, there were piles of mail, and I just walked in and this was it. You know, if you're a soldier coming home from war, at least there's a band playing, there's something. But I hadn't told anybody that I was coming back. And so that really was my homecoming. I didn't have a job, I had no income, and I didn't know what on earth I was going to do. And I was used to working at a rate of knots, and now I had nothing to do. Nobody needed me. And that was really, really hard. And all I could do was look at the internet, see what's happening in Iraq, what was happening to my friends. And then I would go out and walk the streets of London, and my awareness levels were so high, I was always looking for something that was odd and out of place, because that's what you do when you're in Iraq. But in London, everybody looks odd. And so it was hard to spot, who looked out of place. And I just felt, I felt at a loss. I'd go into the supermarket and there'd be 10 different sorts of milk, all the different sorts of bread. And I just wasn't used to having to make these sorts of decisions. And so it really was, it didn't feel like a homecoming at all coming back.
But of course you did what anyone in that situation would do. I'm sure you would all do it too. You went to Sudan.
Yes. I'd never been to the Sudan before, but I just wanted to go somewhere that seemed familiar, that, was back kind of in the Middle East, that had sand, that had blue skies, that had people who spoke Arabic. That's kind of where I wanted to be. And I turned up in the Sudan, and of course it's not really sort of very touristy there, but I did go off to see the pyramids, and I went to a camel market, and I saw whirling dervishes, and I just felt alive again. The excitement, just the new people, and the way people treated me, I just felt it was like a sort of a defibrillator going boom, and bringing me back to life. So I thought, I'm okay.
So it was kind of like your halfway house in between Iraq and trying to fit back into London. But of course it isn't standard in terms of how people cope. And when you went to the United States to take up an offer in Harvard, not surprisingly, the customs officials who don't like those funny visas and stamps somehow weren't convinced that you went on holiday to Sudan. They said, nobody goes on holiday to Sudan. How did you convince them?
Well, I was so excited about going to Harvard. And I turned up, and you're just waiting to have the passport stamped. And he was flicking through, and suddenly looking at these stamps, and then pressed a buzzer, and I was taken off to the special room. So it was Mexicans, Muslims, and me in the special room. And, the guy was looking and goes, "Ma'am, why were you in Iraq?" And so I was in Iraq with the US military. It's like, "Ma'am, you're British." "Ma'am, why were you in Sudan?" And I said I was there on holiday. And it's like, "Ma'am, nobody vacations in Sudan." And so an hour, 2 hours passed, and different people coming to ask me questions. And I think they Googled me, and they found out, yes, she was kind of with the US military in Iraq. But why she went to the Sudan, that was...
They gave you a pass. But how, since the book is going to take us through this next phase of your travels, and of course I'm not going to reveal everything, this is like the first part of the meze, if you like to use a Middle Eastern reference. But I think one question which struck me initially is, what kind of a traveler are you? I travel as a journalist, so I know how I engage with societies, with people. If we may have academics here, they know how they engage. If you're a doctor, if you're a soldier, some as compare you, and I'm sure you don't like this comparison. They say you're a modern day Gertrude Bell of the last century, who of course had a huge role in Iraq, pretty well putting the Hashemites on the throne, establishing the Baghdad Museum. But what if you had to give one word, how would you describe your, what pulls you to do the travels you do?
I didn't go on these travels to report, but I did go, I suppose, in search of some common humanity, that we're in an era which is very fearful of the other. And I just wanted to go out there and experience the different societies. In some places I know people, in other places I'm just totally out there, meeting people, following them into different places, and just finding what it is that we have in common. I feel that everyone that you meet can potentially be your friend, depending on how you interact with them. And I wanted to sort of refine that in myself. After Iraq, there was very, severe circumstances as such. And I'd always been a traveller before, and I wanted to go back out there, regain my instinct for who I could trust, and find the bonds that bind us.
It was interesting. I was quite impressed that everywhere you went, from Khartoum to Kyrgyzstan to Cairo, you always knew somebody that you could stay with. No matter where you went, no matter how far away, there was always somebody that Emma Sky had worked with somewhere else. And your travels are not just about trying to find, what makes each society work, becoming close to the people. It also is about your extraordinary fun, so much mountain climbing, white river rafting, walking, long stretches, and horseback riding. Emma, when she travels, she talks about somehow she kind of gets out of the modern world, feeling I think this was in Kyrgyzstan when you said, I felt so disconnected from the modern world. But like all of us, she uses modern tools for travel, like Facebook. How many of you here are on Facebook and use these social media tools for when you're traveling? Do you use social media? Well, just like Emma did, for example. She put a post when she was going to Kyrgyzstan and said, can anyone give me the name of a shepherd who has a horse? And you got answers.
And
a Kyrgyz shepherd with a horse.
Within 4 or 5 hours, I found a Kyrgyz shepherd with a horse.
On Facebook?
Yes.
How did that happen?
Well, Facebook gets a lot of negative press at the moment, and for good reason. But for me, wherever I travel...
But it's good to find a Kyrgyz shepherd with a horse.
Wherever I travel, I put up on Facebook, here I am. Anybody there who I know? And going to Kyrgyzstan, I didn't really know anybody. Mm-hmm. But I had this romantic idea of riding, following, Alexander the Great. Mm-hmm. I'm a terrible rider, but I had forgotten that. It had been a long time since I'd been on a horse. So sure enough, I found this shepherd who had a horse and was quite prepared to take me through the mountains. But what surprised me at one place, when staying in a yurt, the yurt had Wi-Fi.
The tents, yes. Yes.
And so I logged on to Wi-Fi, and there was all this stuff about how ISIS had taken over a third of Iraq, and I was getting all these messages about what's going on, what's happening. And I thought, here, in such a remote place, where I thought I'd be completely cut off, the news of what was happening in other countries still reached me.
Let's do it'll be a little capsule history fast forward on your trip. In 2011, it was almost as if you had chosen your timing perfectly well. You head to Cairo, and then to Tunis, and then to Damascus. At the time, it was such a lovely expression at the time, the Arab Spring, and sadly came back to haunt the region, and now seems such a misnomer. But you arrived in Cairo in that heat of the moment, and I was interested to see, that when people were chanting, we want to bring down the people want the fall of the regime, you actually joined in, chanting with them.
This was a few months after the fall of the regime, but still every Friday, people would gather in the square, and they would start chanting, Shab, Yurid, Iskat and Nizam. And you listen to that, there's something so rebellious about it, so enticing. And everyone in the square is chanting. And I joined in with them, and it seemed to be this incredible hope, this incredible sense of people reclaiming their dignity, chanting that they wanted better government, that they deserve justice, they deserve to be treated with dignity. And it was an amazing experience. I'd never seen anything like this in Egypt. I'd been a student there many, many years ago, and it was completely different from my memories of Egypt. And I just thought, wow, has the whole society become westernized? The kids in the square look like the Obama supporters in the States. Mm-hmm. And so when you look at that, if you zoom in on that, that really was happening. But when you zoom out a bit, you can see people who were very worried about what was happening. Christian communities, for instance. The Copts were protesting. They'd already had 7 of their churches destroyed, and that had never happened before. And so as I wandered around Egypt, I wandered around Cairo, I was getting different responses, different reactions from a guy in a mosque who was saying, madam, we're a very old civilization. We don't just change in a matter of days. And someone said, it took Allah a week to build the world. You can't just suddenly recreate it in a few days. So there were a few warning signs then, but I was so full of the excitement, I truly believed that something really positive was coming to the Middle East, because it was instigated from within and not by foreign intervention. And so the early days, I was very naive in my hope and my optimism, only imagining that what was coming was going to be better than what they had before.
Yes, and you seem to see, that sort of tantalizing sense of possibility in that new generation in the Middle East, the young people carrying it. In Egypt, they had this wonderful expression, the power of the people is greater than the people in power. It was such a euphoric time. But when you finally got to Damascus, posing as an archaeologist to get a visa, that was also a really good ruse, you saw the warning signs there very, very early on, didn't you?
Yes, I went there in the summer of 2011. And by that stage, I think 2,000 people had already been killed inside Syria. And yet people kept saying, it's not like Iraq. Civil war won't happen here. We're not like them. And it was heartbreaking in a way, because in my mind I had seen civil war, I had seen Iraq, and wanted to warn people that if you keep going down this path, this could end really badly. But there was all this excitement. President Obama had come out and said, basically what Assad is doing is terrible, and he should step aside, basically. And people started to believe that the West was going to intervene. The West was intervening in Libya, got a no-fly zone in Libya to prevent Gaddafi from slaughtering his citizens. And people thought the West is going to intervene inside Syria. So you started to see more and more people thinking it's coming and wanting to be part of it. But there were lots of groups that were very wary of it. And even though it was early days, I could start to see that from, a Palestinian taxi driver who was basically saying, Assad's a good guy, I'm with the regime. And from business people who said business interests stand before interests of sect. And you look at, Damascus, the most incredible, beautiful city, and all these different peoples. And what the protesters were asking was so little. It was so little. They wanted jobs. They wanted transparent government. And Bashar al-Assad thought the Arab Spring is not going to affect Syria because he was relatively new in power, like only 10 years, and relatively young. But when those kids in Dara, a few months before, had written the graffiti, the slogan of the Arab Spring on the wall, and then they'd been arrested, and the families had gone and tried to get them released, and shots had been fired, and then there were deaths and funerals, and things escalated. When the kids were released, there were rumours that they'd been beaten and had their fingernails pulled out. And so this had got an energy of its own. And you look back and you think, Assad could have taken different decisions. He could have done just a little bit. But he refused. He accused all the protesters of being terrorists. He released the hardcore jihadis he had in his jail so that they would become influential in the opposition. And by saying, it's me or the terrorists, he tried to make it, and he did make it, a self-fulfilling prophecy.
These were really intense times, the beginning of something much bigger, and no one at the time could know just how big it would get. And yet, even though you were so caught up, whether it was Egypt or Tunisia or Syria with these unprecedented times, you write how that not a day went by when you didn't think about Iraq. Even though you had left Iraq, Iraq never left you. So you went back in June 2011. So what was that like to go back? Hard.
But almost it felt like a homecoming.
It was more
much more of a homecoming than going back to the UK. So going back to Baghdad, seeing my friends, going back out, and Iraq, I felt such a strong sense of purpose in Iraq. I felt I knew who I was when I was in Iraq. And just to be talking about their concerns, their issues. This was a time when Iraq had had a very good election in 2010, and the election results had not been upheld. And basically, you had Ayed Alawi put together this bloc, Iraqia, that had won the most seats in the elections. And he had campaigned on a platform of Iraq for all Iraqis, no to sectarianism, and had won the support of Iraq's Sunni, secular Shia minority groups. And Nouri al-Maliki, the incumbent, refused to believe the outcome of the elections. It's the Middle East. No one ever loses an election in the Middle East. And so he sat in his seat and he tried to change the results by using de-Baathification, by trying to annul the results in certain places, by demanding a recount. And this had gone on for months and months and months. And there had been disagreement in the American system over what to do. On one side, you had those who believed that the US should uphold the election results and allow the winning bloc to have first go at trying to form the government. On the other side, there were those who argued that Iraq's not ready for democracy, Iraq needs a Shia strongman, and Nouri al-Maliki is our man. And that side had won out. And so the Americans had decided not to uphold the election results. The Iranians had stepped in and had brokered the formation of government with Maliki as prime minister, the Saddurist Muqtada al-Sadr as his key ally. So when I came back, this was 6 months after really the formation of the government, and you could start to see the warning signs, the uptick of assassinations. These things started to happen. And I went back again to Iraq 6 months later, and by that stage, Maliki had accused the Sunni politicians of being terrorists and forced them to flee the country. And I turned up to stay in Baghdad with the Minister of Finance, and he had a tank parked outside his door with the turret pointing at the house. And he just said, we're not going to be able to hold the people back anymore. If the Sunni leaders are being treated that way, imagine what it makes the people think. And so the awakening leaders who had fought against al-Qaeda in Iraq and helped the US military destroy al-Qaeda in Iraq, they were being assassinated, put in jail, forced to flee the country. And you could start to see what was going to come. So yes, it was good to be back, but started to see the warning signs of which way it was going to go in Iraq.
It's really lovely to read how you, in fact, you didn't just go back to Iraq. You went back. There were so many people that you didn't just know. You worked with them. You were part of trying to build the new Iraq after the invasion of 2003. But in those wonderfully warm conversations that went long into the night, and drinking and eating, and there was also hard words for you. They criticized the US soldiers that you work with. One man saying, they have big hearts, but they're naive. People expressing nostalgia for Saddam Hussein. Was that hard? Did you find yourself on the back foot having to defend what the US soldiers that you had helped to advise had tried to do in Iraq? Because you talk about how they were good people, but of course facing major challenges in a country which wasn't their own.
It's really difficult because going back and traveling around the country as a tourist, I was trying to see where all the billions of dollars had gone. Billions and billions of dollars. And yet there was no evidence of things that had been built with it. Where had it gone? You look back a century ago, and there were still roads, bridges, railways, airports that had been built at the time of the British. And the Americans had put masses and masses of money in, but they'd contracted it out to local contractors, and a lot of the money had been stolen. It never gone to where it was intended to go. So the levels of corruption in Iraq were massive. The effort to try and develop it at a rapid pace meant that a lot of people had made a lot of money, and that money had been sort of siphoned off and taken out the country. And there were people, and that, you know, you still hear people say that life was better under Saddam. But it really depends who says that. A lot of people say it, but they're too young to even remember life under Saddam. There's a memory of they were more secure, it was more stable. But if you're Kurdish, life certainly wasn't better under Saddam. And when you look at the mass graves, all the people in the south who were mass murdered, life for them certainly wasn't better under Saddam. I mean, he killed hundreds of thousands of people. Obviously, for those in parts of Baghdad and out in the west and in bits of the north, their world has been completely destroyed. And many of them have been exiled from the country.
Of course, tonight we can't, I'm sure here there's people who know well the history of Iraq. It's many layers and many reasons why it went wrong. But one of them, of course, which has relevance today as Iraq and Syria still confront so-called Islamic State, is that the promises made by the Americans, when you fight with us in the awakening to get rid of Al-Qaeda, therefore you'll be integrated into the Iraqi army, and those promises weren't kept by Maliki, and so therefore the Americans found themselves being part of a betrayal, if you like.
Yes, and there is a great sense of that betrayal because the awakening leaders, the American forces had fought alongside. They were brothers in arms with these awakening leaders. When I was in Damascus, I tracked down one of the awakening leaders who I'd known very well. And he'd trying to get a visa to go to America. There was no chance. All those people who really thought that they would be able to get refugee status, the doors were closing. There was no place for them to go. So for the awakening, there was a sense of this massive betrayal of them. And basically Maliki's policies, targeting of the Sunni politicians, reneging on promises to the awakening, created the conditions that enabled Al-Qaeda, or enabled ISIS, to rise up out of the ashes of Al-Qaeda in Iraq and proclaim that it was the defender of the Sunnis against the Iranian-backed sectarian regime of Nouri al-Maliki. And that didn't need to happen.
It's interesting to reflect on this now, because I'm sure everyone here is aware we're waiting any day now for President Trump to declare that the caliphate is over, because they're down to 1 square mile in Syria. And so it was that moment you mentioned in the yurt in Kyrgyzstan when you heard that, you know, the rise of Islamic State, the declaration of the caliphate, and the collapse of the Iraqi army. And you wrote how you were surprised at how it collapsed so quickly. I mean, it was a lightning advance by so-called Islamic State across Iraq and then into Syria. And you who know so much about the Iraqi army couldn't believe how it just collapsed. And if you think, again, billions have been spent training and equipping this Iraqi army, it outnumbered ISIS massively, 100 to 1. And you think, how did that happen? And basically, after the US military withdrew in 2011, Maliki gets his second term and the US forces are all pulled out. Maliki replaced those officers in the army who he regarded as too close to the Americans. He just replaced them with guys who were loyal to him. They were lackeys. They didn't have the expertise or the experience, but they were loyal to him. And these guys had taken the money that they were supposed to use to buy food and equipment for their soldiers and just pocketed it. So when ISIS came in, no orders were given by the officers to their soldiers to fight. The officers weren't with the soldiers and didn't lead them to fight. And the soldiers just took off their uniforms, left all their equipment, and fled. And ISIS took over all the Humvees, the MRAPs, and all this kit, and they were having to download manuals of the internet to work out how to use it. And these guys in the loudspeaker, does anyone know how to drive an M1 Abrams tank? You know, please make yourself known. Emma Sky. Yes, yes. So people are now looking back at what caused the rise of Islamic State, and they're doing it partly because they're worried that the same conditions are in place. The corruption, the resentment, the abuses at the hands of the security forces. But I was interested in the kind of challenges that you confronted when you went through the region. You write an anecdote from Jordan in Amman when you're having dinner with friends and someone hurls the accusation at you and says the United States created Islamic State. And some of you may have heard that before as well. And you write how you groaned to hear this conspiracy theory, but there is something to be said in this whole complex atmosphere that led to the rise of these extremists. The conditions of the American military presence were one of the threads. Baghdadi, who declared the caliphate, was in Camp Bucca, which they called University of Jihad. It was a radicalizing place, and they all came out of there, and the rest is history.
No, it's very true. When people say America created ISIS, there's a conspiracy theory as if the Americans deliberately created ISIS to keep Sunni and Shia fighting each other forever so that America could stay in the region. And that is the conspiracy theory that I push back on. But of course, if there hadn't been the Iraq War and the collapse of the state of Iraq, we wouldn't have had Al-Qaeda, we wouldn't have had ISIS. Now, we didn't have to go that way. I mean, the US, the UK should never have invaded Iraq. It was based on the premise that Saddam had weapons of mass destruction, a faulty premise. But nothing that happened in Iraq afterwards was inevitable, and decisions taken by the coalition to de-Ba'athify, like remove the senior civil servants, dismiss the military, collapse the state.
And some of them joined ISIS.
Yes. I don't think any country could have survived what we did to Iraq. And so it was in the collapse of the state that people formed gangs. All these insurgent groups rose up. And because there was nobody guarding the country, the borders of the country, it meant that any jihadi who was against the American project could come into Iraq to fight the Americans. So yes, the collapse of the state created the conditions for Al-Qaeda in Iraq. And lots who were former Iraqi army used to have moustaches, grew beards, became Islamist, and joined the insurgency, some in nationalist groups, some with Al-Qaeda in Iraq. But Al-Qaeda in Iraq was defeated by 2009. It was defeated during that period that we called the Surge, when you had extra US forces, you had the Sunni awakening, that defeated Al-Qaeda in Iraq. And we thought that was how the story ended. We thought that was it. It had been through a bad time, and now Iraq was headed in the right direction. But it was under President Obama that the next iteration, ISIS, rose up. And, Obama administration didn't uphold the election results. Pulled the troops out, just said, okay, look, you don't want us, we're going.
The Iraqis didn't make it easy, yeah.
No, the Iraqis didn't really make it easy at all. So Obama just said, okay, we're out of here. And he saw, he wanted to get out of the Middle East, to pivot towards Asia. He just thought there's nothing we can do in the Middle East. Every time we try and help in the Middle East, it just goes bad. And he'd been quite optimistic at the beginning of the Arab Spring, and by the end, he just thought, we can't help. He wanted to get America out of the region, pivoting towards Asia. So, yes, when you look at people like Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, he'd been arrested in 2003, 2004, held in Bucca. He had been a member of the Muslim Brotherhood before, but he had left that and joined a more sort of radical group. But again, in jail, it's where people made new networks and they made new bonds. And the conditions were created for jihadism. So the first iteration was Al-Qaeda, that was defeated, but the conditions were there. And when the conditions were there, when Maliki was being horrible, that led Sunni tribes to look at Maliki and to look at ISIS and conclude that ISIS was the lesser of two evils. Well, the government's got to be pretty bad for you to think that ISIS is going to be the lesser of two evils. So it did create those conditions. And this time, you had a confluence of factors of the Arab Spring kicking off inside Syria. You had ISIS able to move in to Syria. And the whole thing about the Iraq war had changed the balance of power in the region in Iran's favor. And that led Saudi and the Gulfies to think, okay, we've lost Iraq, but let's try and push back on Iran inside Syria. So the impact of the Iraq war was really felt inside Syria. I mean, the architects of the Iraq war said it would lead to Iraq as a democracy. This would spread democracy through the region and bring peace to Israel. That were the architects. When the Arab Spring kicked off, the architect was saying this is a democracy movement coming through the region. But what came out of Iraq was a new iteration of jihadis, this geopolitical power struggle.
Whoever wrote that policy paper should get the sack. Yes. And now people are asking, everyone is, words of caution saying just because the caliphate has ended and that magnet for foreign fighters and the territorial control doesn't mean that Islamic State is gone. They talk about Islamic State 2.0. Do you worry that for the way Iraq and the region, that something else will rise in its wake? Or it will adapt?
We've kind of been in this situation before. So 2009, we thought Al-Qaeda in Iraq was defeated. This was the end. And now you look, the physical caliphate is defeated. It used to control land the size of the UK. Now it's down to this little village, Baghouz, that no one had heard of before a week ago. And there's just a few hundred fighters there. But the way ISIS was fought was different from the way Al-Qaeda in Iraq was fought. Al-Qaeda in Iraq was fought by using Sunni tribes and American forces on the ground working with the Sunni tribes. So the Sunni tribes turned against Al-Qaeda in Iraq. For them, it was an honorable way out of insurgency. They become the heroes that helped save the country. In the fight against ISIS, the coalition, US-led coalition, provided air power, but worked with local forces on the ground, local militias. And so Sunni groups were not involved in the defeat of ISIS. Sunni towns have been pulverized. When you look at Mosul, when you look at Aleppo, these used to be cities of culture and cosmopolitanism, multicultural, extraordinary places, and they have been absolutely pulverized. Iran brought in Shia militias from Lebanon, from Iraq, from Afghanistan to fight inside Syria. Kurds extended the territory under their control in Iraq and then inside Syria. And you look at all of this and you see Assad still in power. Everybody committed crimes in Syria, but he committed the majority of them. So 500,000 people killed, half the country displaced from their homes, and he's still in power. So where does it go from here? I mean, now with the Arab Spring, the counter-revolution won. We're back to authoritarian regimes oppressing their people. But such a security-focused approach, it can't win in the long term unless these regimes reform, unless they provide jobs for their people, treat their people with some respect and dignity. There will be a new sense of grievance, and there'll be people coming out again to protest, and that will create the next iteration of insurgency. So even though it's a lull now, we shouldn't lack imagination of what might come if the regimes don't reform, foremost among them Syria.
And harder with each phase for outsiders to understand, much less to actually help to change it for the better. And yet people like you and many of your friends keep getting pulled back to a region like this. President Obama kept talking about the pivot to Asia, yet he kept getting pull back as well. You have this lovely anecdote about John Jenkins, who you stayed with in Saudi Arabia when he was the British ambassador there, and you mentioned that he's one of the Foreign Office's best-known Arabists. And then you meet him in London on his bicycle, and he says, "I'm never going back to the Middle East. It's making me ill." And every time I see John Jenkins, he's in the Middle East. He's still there, still keeps going back. What is it? What pulls people?
You know, I fell in love with the Middle East when I was 18 and went there for the first time. There is something extraordinary about the people. There is something, they have things there that we have lost here. That sense of community, the sense of family, the bonds between people are so strong. The sense that there's something more important than consumerism and shopping. And whenever I go there, when I look at the markets, the sound of the muezzin, it still draws me. There is something extraordinary there, a sense of history. You know, it's the region where the 3 monotheistic religions came out of. It has extraordinary history, extraordinary heritage, and will continue, I think, to enchant, despite all the terrible things that have happened to it. They have terrible governments, but there are wonderful, wonderful people in the Middle East.
And this really, this amazing sense of humor, and I'm sure everyone who's worked in the Middle East knows it. This wonderful anecdote, so many of us have been on airlines where the flight is cancelled. So you're in the queue in Istanbul, your flight to Erbil is cancelled, so there's you in this whole queue of Syrians, Iraqis trying to get to Erbil. So one Syrian puts up and says, "Look at her, she's pregnant, she's ill, she needs a hotel room, give her a hotel room." And the other Syrian behind you goes, "Yes, and I'm the father of that baby." So all of you become this makeshift family, and you go to the front of the queue to get rooms in Istanbul. It's just brilliant. And I'm sure it happens like all the time. Not
They
that
keep
people
saying,
pregnant.
"Go like this." I don't really look very pregnant.
But you went because you wanted to do something, not just to have a laugh, not just to travel, not just to go, whitewater rafting, to make a difference. And your book ends on quite a profound note about your purpose. What was the purpose of it? What did you achieve? And you meet fellow travelers who also spent years of their life trying to make a difference. And what is the reckoning there?
It is very hard. I mean, for those of us who were involved in the post-9/11 wars, and there's a couple of here tonight, it's really hard because we look at what did our wars achieve. And as my travels continued, and I was trying to look at what was the impact of the Iraq War, and it had led in a way to the unraveling of the Middle East, and then the refugee crisis into Europe that was melting down the European Union, and this fear of the flood of migrants from the Arab world was causing this rise in populism, which contributed to Brexit, to Trump, to all of these factors. And so it's been really hard. You look at people who've come out of other wars, and out of the end of the Second World War came the European Union. And the idea that out of our wars, out of all that effort, out of all that loss of life, there wasn't a better peace. And so I think it really has been hard, and people have reacted in different ways. And some have gone off to ashrams and spent their time there, and others have gone into politics, and others just trying to understand, how do we do things differently in the future? How do we break out of this cycle, which just has us going back to supporting authoritarian leaders and selling them weapons in the hope that they will crush their opposition? And then we end up with things like ISIS again. So we keep getting sucked back in. So how do we break that? How do we learn from the past and look to do things differently? I think there's plenty of people who want to just cut off from the Middle East and just think we do no good there, let's stay away. But what happens in the Middle East isn't contained in the Middle East. So whether it's the refugee flows or the terrorism, it's not contained there. So we do have a national interest, but we really have to reflect on ourselves with a lot of humility about what has been our role in helping to create the very problems that we then get called back to solve.
One thing which comes very clearly in reading your book and all the people that you meet, and as I mentioned at the beginning, everywhere you go, you're meeting strangers, but mostly you're meeting friends, Iraqis, Syrians, people from the countries, and they're glad to see you. And so even if some of the efforts were in vain or didn't work out the way they should have, people would have wanted, it wasn't for lack of trying. And it's the commitment. When you come to a country again and again, it matters to people. They have a sense that the world is standing with them. Perhaps they'd hoped the world could do more, but even that, it's what shines through is even your determination to stand with them, not to leave them, matters and has resonance.
I mean, I look at some of my best friends in all the world are Iraqis. There's not a day goes by when I'm not in communication with Iraqis, whether it's WhatsApp or Facebook. There's constantly communications. And if a week goes by and I haven't spoken with somebody, they're like, what's happened? Why are you not in touch? There really are these strong bonds. And as I went out for lunch one time with an Iraqi sheikh who had been forced to leave the country, was now in Jordan. And as the waiter came over to take our orders, and he turned to the waiter and said, you know, even though they destroyed our country, we still invite them out for lunch. And that's kind of the Iraqi humor.
I mean, it's been a real privilege to read your book and to get a little taste and to walk with you on your incredible journey across the region. I think we should all thank Emma for both her. Thank you. Let me open it up to you, because I'm sure you have your questions as well for Emma. They're stunned. They don't know what. Yes, good.
Thank you very much. You're both brave.
Uh-huh.
Naomi Klein said that when Paul Bremer went into Iraq,
Canadian social science, yeah.
Yeah. Oh, Naomi Klein. Most
Yes,
people
yes.
know. He brought in basically hyper-capitalism. I mean, really, were they going in there to establish democracy? They privatized, they deregulated, they did what Americans love to do, and the ultra-right. And she felt that there was no way they were going in there to create a real democracy. They were going in there to exploit a country. Just wondered if you have any comments on that.
You know, I was there right from the beginning, from 2003, and I worked for Ambassador Bremer. And, you know, you can only understand the Iraq War in the context of 9/11. That fear that there was going to be another attack. And that's what kind of craziness led to the invasion. And after invading and finding that there weren't weapons of mass destruction, so what are we there for? And so the mission changed from removing the WMD, which they didn't have, to help them bring about democracy. And Iraq, if you like, became an incubator for all these ideas about democracy. So even though some people like to say, yes, the West just wanted to get the oil and do all of that, and somebody who was there at the time, that wasn't the case. There really was this attempt to bring about democracy, but to bring it about as if the Iraqis themselves didn't count. They were like the passive recipients of our benevolence. And so it was, you know, opening all the borders, free trade, doing away with state-owned enterprises. It was a massive shock that was put through. But it wasn't about stealing the oil. It was using Iraq as an incubator, if you like, for this rapid democratization.
Is that democracy or is that free markets?
Well, I think the theory at the time was that they came together.
The aside
heard
was
that
they can't.
whisper.
The aside was they can't tell the difference. Thank you. Yes.
Thank you for the talk. It was really interesting. Obviously, in the story where you're also talking about interacting with people, social media became very important. And with ISIS, another big issue is that they use social media very, very well. But what people don't really talk about is how, if at all, social media affects the Iraqi when it comes to communicating ideas of protest, democracy, or as an agent for movement at all. I don't know.
It's a very good point, because at the start of the Arab Spring, people talked about, a Twitter revolution, a Facebook revolution. So the social media was being used to great effect by young activists to organize, to mobilize, and to spread ideas. And that was the hope, really, of those who created those tools. It was supposed to connect us all and to bring about goodness. Well, we soon discovered that those very same tools could be used to recruit jihadis, to groom people in the UK, to go out and fight. They could be used by governments to surveil their citizens. And so they could be used for good and for bad. And this thing that was supposed to bring us all together, ISIS, Al-Qaeda, was chopping off people's heads, putting up on YouTube and spreading it and making people fearful. And you could see the TV channels. Al Jazeera became a tool of those who wanted, to go very much against the Syrian regime. And so opposition people would load up things straight to Al Jazeera. And so Al Jazeera, before it had this image of being, telling the truth, being very fair, suddenly became seen as a tool of those opposed to the Syrian regime. And so in the Middle East, every different political party had its own media, social media, and was using it more and more to spread hate rather than bringing people together. So if you think at the beginning of the Arab Spring, it seemed to be the whole youth was speaking with one voice. And yet, that unity quickly was taken away because of the hatred, the rumors that were used and that were spread through social media and the media.
Wait for the microphone. So, yes, because it's live stream. So,
if you were advising the British government now, easy question, what would you tell them to do about Assad now? Because do you accept a fait accompli, or do we continue to say that he should step down, or do we just back off?
It's very difficult. We are where we are now. And I think when you look at Syria, there were many different opportunities from 2011 onwards where different decisions could be taken. Today, Assad has basically won. He remains in power thanks to the Russians and to the Iranians. I think we became very fixated on whether it was Assad or ISIS. And at the end of the day, we decided that Assad was the lesser of two evils. This fixation with terrorism hasn't really been very helpful. I think it's much better to look at terrorism as a symptom of a problem. The problem is the governance. So what to do about that? And we need to look at ourselves with great humility and look up, we've got 100 years experience in the region. We need to look with a little bit of humility and learn from that experience. How do we help regimes reform? How do we set incentives for reform? Now with the information era, power is becoming more and more diffused, more and more devolved, so it's hard to govern anywhere. We've got problems governing ourselves, so we should be a little bit humble about advising others how they should govern themselves. But this thing with the diffusion of power, are there going to be more opportunities at the local level to build better governance that meets the needs of their people? And I think there's a lot that we can learn from each other. So I would urge us to accept more students in our universities, more opportunities for people to come here and learn from the experiences of the UK. We don't need to be going over there telling them how to do their things. We need to be sharing our experiences and learning. But Assad has basically won for now. And I think that is the reality.
I should mention too in that context that one of the many things Emma does now is she's at the Jackson Institute at Yale University in the United States, and she runs the Yale World Fellows. So every year, what is each batch is how many people?
It's 16.
16. And the extraordinary, when you look at the list of people, the best and the brightest, the most interesting from countries around the world, they come and they spend a semester at Yale. So the deadline is finished for this year, but you can always think about it for next year. Yeah. Thank you for your question. Yes.
Why are we so bad at making decisions? Every decision seems to be wrong. It's been 18 years since 2001, since 9/11. And we've made, as according to you, many, many, many mistakes. And we continue to make them.
That's being asked by someone who works for the BBC.
I mean journalists as well.
No, we don't always make wrong decisions, and I think it's important to look at, you can look at the 2007 to 2009 time period in Iraq, and that was the period we had the right strategy, the right resources, and the right leadership, and we helped bring Iraq out of its civil war. So it's not just a series of every time there's a decision to be made, we take the wrong decision. When you're outside government, you just think that government is full of bad people conspiring. When you're in government, you realize it's full of incredibly hardworking, dedicated civil servants who are trying to do the right thing, trying to make the best decisions with the information that they have. You don't have all the information. It is really, really difficult, and you're constantly weighing up all these different things. I think in Iraq, one of the biggest problems we had was making the wrong assumptions. Partly in Iraq, we were following the US lead, and Americans just culturally are much more optimistic than Brits. And in Brits, it's always why we're so terrible. And in America, it's like we're just fantastic. So Americans are very optimistic. And maybe if a bit more of the British pessimism had managed to influence the US at the beginning, maybe we'd have been less naive in the assumptions that we made. But it's difficult. It's difficult working in large organizations. It's difficult working in coalitions. It's difficult working with allies. But it's far worse not to have any allies. So we're caught in that difficult circumstance. It's getting harder and harder to govern because of the information era. So before, if you were in power, you had much more knowledge than anyone else. It was more of a hierarchy. And now the hierarchy has kind of gone like this. And so those in power don't really have more knowledge. And we can get all the information as quickly as well. So it's becoming harder and harder. And I think the challenge when you look at the situation today, instead of just sitting criticizing, it's how do we all participate? What can we all do to try and help improve the situation in our own country, let alone abroad?
The Iraq War had a paralyzing effect on, particularly on Western governments. Many, when the time came to decide whether and how to intervene in Syria, many said, including publics in Iraq, in the United States and across Europe, look at what happened with the major investments of time, money, troops, both in Iraq and Afghanistan, and we failed. They only got worse. So we shouldn't tread where we simply have no business. And so people held back. And some people said that we shouldn't have allowed it to paralyze us. We should have, as I think you were suggesting, is we should have drawn the lessons and tried to find a new way to engage, which certainly takes a greater account of what the people themselves ask for and what they think are the best solutions, rather than coming in with their own ideas. But I think there has been that negative effect of Iraq, and particularly Britain, because of what happened with the intelligence. So people are very skeptical now about claims that the intelligence is telling us this or telling us that.
And I think that's absolutely true, and we really saw that in 2013, after Assad had used chemical weapons in East Ghouta.
Yes.
And when that happened, and Obama had said that is a red line, But when the British Parliament met to debate that issue, Cameron lost the vote, and that was the first time a Prime Minister had lost a vote to use military force since the foundation of the United States. And the impact that that had, because everybody, you know, the parliamentarians, when they voted on Syria, they weren't voting on Syria, they were voting on Iraq. And the impact that that decision had, because when Obama saw that, he'd got all the US military was lined up to retaliate for the use of chemical weapons. But when the British vote came in, he pulled back and he punted it to Congress, knowing that that was never going to happen. And I think when you look at Syria, it really brought an end to that whole concept of an international community. The whole idea of we're not going to stand by when a government mass murders its people.
The responsibility to protect and humanitarian intervention.
I think all of that came to an end inside Syria. There's been complete impunity for the bombing of hospitals, schools, use of chemical weapons. And so that sense of what do we stand for has kind of gone. You know, you think at the end of the Cold War, there was talk of this new world order, liberal democracy from here on out. And civil wars did come to an end, billions came out of poverty. It was really an optimistic time. You had an active UN Security Council. You had willingness to commit UN peacekeeping forces. There was this real sense that this is the way forward. And yet the Iraq War has totally undermined that, taken away not only our willingness to do things, but also our self-belief that we can do things. And we're living with the consequences in terms of the fallout of, you know, the refugees. That's going to be, you know, challenging. Mostly it challenges the region, because most of the refugees are kept in the neighboring countries. But there are hundreds of thousands who have gone beyond the region. And if you think of people who are going to be stuck in refugee camps, if they've got no hope or no opportunity for the future, what's going to happen to them? So that, you know, everyone thinks, phew, we didn't get involved inside Syria. But the consequences of allowing what happened inside Syria, to allowing that mass murder to take place, allowing ISIS to take over, you know, a country the size of the UK, 10 million people, there are going to be repercussions. This is not the end of a story.
These two gentlemen. And then
Well, this is actually a question for both of you. And as somebody who's lived and worked in the Middle East quite extensively over the last 8 or 9 years, it's a question that keeps coming to my mind, and to ask both of you, when you see such atrocities and you see so many injustices, it's a balance between being an activist and a journalist. So how, in your minds, both of you, make that separation between wanting to make a difference but feeling the need to report objectively?
Lisa, I'm going to let you go first on that. How do you feel as a
I'm the moderator
journalist?
here. I'm the moderator. I think, like Emma, I think it's an incredible privilege and a responsibility to, when you enter someone else's country, when people open their hearts and their homes to you. I always say, when it comes to my profession, you know, I've been doing it for some 30 years. I'm still amazed to this day that I can go anywhere and basically say to someone, can I ask you a question? And they say yes. And if they don't, well, that's a story too. But the way people, even in their moment of most intense grief, even at moments where they've lost almost everything, will stop and talk to us and share their story. And, you know, I'm a journalist. I always say, thank God I only have to write about it or talk about it. And I believe my job is to convey what I've seen, not emotionally, because I don't think any of our listeners, viewers want to see an emotional correspondent on the screen, because then it becomes about us. But I do fundamentally believe in empathy. Empathy meaning that we have to try to understand the person in front of you, the people, the society, try to stand in their shoes and to convey that. And I think it's exactly what Emma said. It's about a shared humanity. And as much as we want to pull ourselves, inside our own world, and we all do it, we all pull ourselves into our world, and we all define our world in a certain way. For some of us, it's a street, a city. Some of it's the wider world. But we live in a time where none of us can say, "Oh, I didn't know that was happening." We make a decision not to know what is happening. And I really believe that everyone has their little piece in the world. So I'm a journalist, and Emma chose to take the most demanding of all, to actually not just witness something, not just write about something, but try to change something. It's the hardest in some ways, but it's a great privilege as well. But it also can be profoundly painful, but also profoundly touching that you were actually part of something much bigger than yourself.
Yes, I mean, I didn't choose journalism as a path. I chose development as such, and I would look at these problems and want to go out and help fix them. And after 25 years, or first 10 years was Israel-Palestine, trying to help bring about peace in the Middle East. I thought that was my purpose in life, and that went well. And then I went to Iraq, and I thought, here, I've learned everything from Israel-Palestine. I've learned so much about mediation, conflict resolution, capacity building. I can apply these skills. But after almost a decade there, I wanted to stop, and instead of trying to fix things, to try and understand the problem better. And that has been a reflection, because I don't believe, Iraq wasn't preordained to break down as it did. The Arab Spring wasn't preordained to fail. There are lots of people on the ground trying to work for good outcomes. And it's how can you help those people achieve the good outcomes and not just give in to those sinister people, we have them everywhere, but to not let them win out. I do believe that individuals can make a difference, that all of us every day and how we interact with people can make a difference.
Just a quick follow-up. Do you feel like it's more important to address the people locally in their problems or to try to change public opinion?
Public opinion in where?
Well, in
Microphone.
talking about the issues, especially of Israel-Palestine, trying to raise consciousness about the situation.
I think it's multi-pronged approaches, isn't it? You need public opinion to go in support of positive outcomes. You need leadership to lead that public opinion. You need activists willing to mobilize people. So you need people at all different levels to participate in this. But leadership is key. And unfortunately, we see a dearth of leadership all around the place at the moment. And it's not an accident. It's very, very hard to lead in these circumstances. Much easier to be a critic on the side, much harder to step into the arena.
Thank you.
If you were asked again to take on another assignment, would you have to think hard before you accepted it? Would you accept it?
Yes, I probably would accept, because I feel, I've learned a huge amount through all of this. And I want to help pass on that learning to others. And I think of people who mentored me, who I learned from. How can I help? I mean, I help through teaching and I help through the World Fellows. But my heart has always been out on the ground, trying to mediate, prevent conflict, end conflict. And so, yes, if asked again, I probably would go.
You said that at one point what we should be doing is sort of providing a good example or showing how what we can do and providing lessons of how these societies can improve themselves. but right from the very first question about, us people not understanding the difference between consumerism and democracy, the things we can see now with Brexit and Trump's, with a reaction with people feeling that their problems aren't being addressed by government. Where are the examples in the West that are the good examples that we could pass on to the Middle East? Because they seem to be absent at the moment.
I mean, our own societies, we have a crisis of governance as well. So in the Middle East, this crisis comes out as ISIS. Here it comes out as Brexit. And in America, it comes out as Trump. And everybody can focus on these things, but these are symptoms of a problem. Because of this new era that we're in. And you think the pace of change is really speeding up. We have a climate in crisis. We have all of these things. And so it's trying to work out how we can be more effective, and that's probably locally now, in our own communities, because that's where the power has gone. So I think, the lesson for all of us is how do we all step up, become more involved in community, more involved in politics, more willing to help save ourselves. You think Britain is a great country. It used to govern a quarter of the world. Today it can't govern itself. So there's a crisis here. And there's no point just sitting there, turning off the radio every time they mentions Brexit and going on about how bad the politicians are. Make us feel better, but it's not contributing to anything. So what is it that we can do? What's a new type of system that's required for here? We've got quite a devolved governance system anyway. We have interesting asymmetrical federalism. What more needs to be done? I think the shock with Brexit was people realised they didn't know half the country. Whichever way you went, you didn't know half the country. So we all live in our little bubbles, not communicating with others. When you go travelling, you're taken out of your bubble, you're bumping into people all the time. And perhaps we need to travel in our own country and get to know each other a bit better. I think we have an amazing society. I walk down the streets in London, I hear all these different languages, I see people from all over the world, and we take it for granted that we live here in harmony. You don't have that in other places. It's something extraordinary, but it's not something we should take for granted. And so I think people can learn a lot from us, and I think we need to improve ourselves and be a good example to others.
And you cannot exaggerate the importance of rule of law. As much as we want to criticize that, policing is not without problems, the legal system is not without problems, but rule of law in a country of institutions, freedom of expression, as says, we do take them for granted, but they are the building blocks of a society, and so many societies don't have them.
But then we take that for granted. We reduce the budget for legal aid, and we start doing things that will undermine our own
yes, health system, education, yeah. Okay, these here, and then they'll come to the front again. Thank you for your questions.
Good evening. You have mentioned a few times Afghanistan, which was so intimately linked with Iraq in the beginning, and suddenly, almost like they separated. And we talk a lot these days about the fatigue of Afghanistan. And what is this sense of fatigue that you might have experienced covering, for instance, something like Iraq? And what kind of parallels can you draw from what we are facing right now on the Afghan conflicts, which is the question of the US really pulling out and this super rushed.
Are you from Afghanistan?
No, I'm not. I wish. no.
What's your interest in Afghanistan?
Work-based, yeah, mainly. So, so this pull out and this what we are calling about a quick peace process and a quick negotiations with the Taliban and hasty moves. Is there anything? Do you relate to that at all right now, having lived similar situations with Iraq?
We've been at war in Afghanistan for 18 years, and it's become this forever war that is problematic in many ways. That it's almost that the policymakers couldn't see any other option but to keep continuing because the risk of doing something different might be greater than the risk of doing the same. And when President Trump came along, he's almost like the only leader who can come out with, I'm going to end the wars. Obama tried to end the wars and he couldn't. The bureaucracy, the military, there were so many sunk costs that they said we've got to keep going. So President Trump, his instinct is to end these wars. And of course how he goes about it is a complete and total, inappropriate way by tweet and not really telling anybody. But these wars do need to come to an end. But the way they come to an end is really important. In Iraq, it could have ended well in 2010 if America had upheld the election results and could have had a decent relationship with the country, and that could have prevented ISIS. When you look at Afghanistan today, it's quite reminiscent to what happened in Vietnam. And I was just in Vietnam on holiday last month, and all the parallels were quite striking. I think after all of this loss, and it's the Afghan people who have lost so much, is America suddenly going to deal with the Taliban, exclude the Afghan government, and get out? And you think, surely that can't be how that war ends. Because that's problematic for many reasons. It's problematic in particular for the women of Afghanistan, but it's problematic because the regional powers, what they want to gain out of Afghanistan. So it is worrying, but these wars, we can't be forever at war. And I think what happened in America, you ended up with almost like a war economy. That, Eisenhower warned about this, decades ago, the military-industrial establishment. And what has happened is America is stuck in this cycle of being forever at war and never winning. And of course there's economy, there's people who benefit from that. But in the meantime, America was eroding its own resilience, its own reputation globally, its own self-belief. And while this was happening, the East was rising. China has been rising at the rate of knots. And so when Obama stood back and thought, whoa, the bigger issue, the big grand strategic issue is actually the Far East, it's Asia, and we are getting sucked into all of this counter-terrorism, constant never-ending wars. And what's happened, 3,000 people killed on 9/11. Since 9/11 in these wars, it's led to the death of hundreds of thousands of people and the proliferation of these different groups that are now not only in Afghanistan and the Middle East, they've gone down through Africa. I thought that can't just keep going that way.
Yeah, I can't promise to be a politic or even that bright around this kind of stuff, but a couple of comments you've talked about during the evening. You've talked about we have 100 years of experience there. Well, they have thousands of years, and it seems to me this conversation is very much based on what we can do to bring them. And I guess as a coach and mentor, I generally find people come when they're ready to come. So I don't know what the solution will be, but if we are going into countries where there is a plain discord and a plain need for improvement, having someone like Britain with a history of dominating half the planet, as you talked about before, not through smart governance, but just through having better armed forces, I don't think is necessarily the best way of doing it. And I don't know what the solution is, but it seems to me that every time you replace somebody in a position of authority, those people don't seem to have the ethics and the ethos that we would like them to have to create a better country. They just seem to get sucked back down into what they've been used to. And I don't know what the solution will be, because you could argue you should be trying to help the people that are corrupt to understand better and come about change over a period of time rather than one political cycle where the next person coming in changes their mind and starts with a new solution again. Just wonder what your comments were.
I mean, I agree with you. I'm not advocating that we have 100 more years of British colonialism. So that's not the point. I want us to learn the right lessons from the last 100 years in terms of humility, what it is, what change can we affect, and to better understand the problem before we try and affect change. when you look at Europe, Europe progressed through wars. So out of the terrible decades of wars, what came after that was progress. And in the Middle East, every time there's been a war or a coup, what came afterwards was worse. And so you look at this incomplete nation building, you look at elites that captured the state and just extracted the resources of the state. And for a while, this could keep going because there was enough oil and there was a social contract. So when the regimes just gave people jobs, public sector jobs, and they gave them education and security, and in return the people just kept their mouths closed. But that social contract has frayed. The oil price has gone down. There's been a massive demographic bulge like this. Climate change is really affecting the Middle East. All of these things are happening, and regimes couldn't provide jobs for everybody. And people started to protest, and we got the Arab Spring. And yet the counter-revolution has won there. And it's not strong enough to keep people down forever unless the regimes reform, unless they provide more opportunities, and those jobs can't all be public sector, they have to be private sector as well, then there will be another iteration. And that's the challenge. And too often we get sucked back into selling weapons, giving legitimacy to bad leaders. And it's how we break that cycle. So what can we do to set incentives to really bring about reform? Trade blocks, educational opportunities, and diversify away from the old patterns. There's no simple solutions. This is a generational problem that the Middle East is facing, and it's going through all of this in a very difficult era globally, because before, democracy looked like the best type of governance, and people would look to the West. Nowadays, it doesn't look so good. And yet you've got the Chinese model. People aren't queuing up to get visas to go and live in China. There's still something very attractive about the West. People would rather live in the West if they had to move elsewhere. But these are trying times for everybody.
Thank you for your question. You don't look happy.
It's the same thing about what do you do? I mean, what would happen if we just left people to it? Would they evolve like the West has evolved into a decent society, or not? It's just the world always wants to seem to help someone, and they can't seem to leave aside the political aspects of it and the economic aspects. And I get that. I mean, that's kind of what I do as well. But it just seems to me that what we're doing isn't working, and you could turn to walk away and be called a coward or turning your back, or you can keep getting involved in what seems to me to be a process that just goes round and round in circles. I don't know what the solution is. When I'm thinking, I don't know who does.
I mean, sometimes it's probably making the distinction between going to countries effectively uninvited, or going for all the wrong reasons, or going for reasons which benefit you, the invader, more than the people that you pretend or claim and sometimes believe that you're going to help. And I think you're absolutely right that, was Kofi Annan, bless him, who talked about African solutions for African problems. And there is this new generation. There needs to be, and you can't even say the Middle East, and Emma knows well, I mean, there's going to be an Egyptian solution, a Syrian solution, an Arab solution, and it will come from, hopefully, this new generation of educated people. We asked about Afghanistan. I mean, there are moments where they do look to their neighbors, to people of goodwill beyond their borders. And I'll take one instance in Afghanistan where, yes, the West went in and pretended they were going to help, and said they were going to help Afghan women, who suffered so terribly at the hands of the Taliban. We haven't kept all our promises to Afghan women, but at certain moments where there was key legislation, and Afghan women activists basically begged capitals around the world, call Kabul, tell them how important it is. And when pressure was put on reluctant people to do the good thing, sometimes friends outside can make a difference. But it's in response to a call from people on the ground who need support. Sometimes that support backfires. In Egypt, people suffered terribly because they were seen to be getting money from the West, doing projects with the West. So sometimes it doesn't work, and that's where I think we have to find where we can be involved at the invitation and the needs of others, and where we have to step back, because I think we do more harm than good. And I think we need to have the humility, as you've said, time and again, but also the understanding of what it is we're getting into. I think you're absolutely right to raise the point. Thank you.
Hi, I just wanted to know really your thoughts on Iran, and perhaps whether you fear Iran and its influence in the Middle East. And I suppose one thing that you said earlier about it really resonated. I've been living in Tehran for 3 years, and when I first arrived, there was this sense of optimism because the nuclear deal had been signed and people thought they were going to have more moderate, responsive governance, and it was all going to slowly, incrementally change. But by the time I left, the nuclear deal had been ripped up and everyone's feeling very depressed, and the vast majority of Tehranis I know don't support its geopolitical ambitions. So what are your thoughts on what we should do with Iran? Like, what should Western policy be on Iran? Because in some respects, by putting pressure that affects this kind of incremental change in its political system, it's maybe a disservice to those young Tehranis who are waiting, and those young Iranians who are waiting for the system to change for itself. And how do we balance that out between its sort of destabilizing activities in the Middle East? What are your thoughts on Iran?
Thank you. I've never been to Iran, so I really only know Iran through the lens of Iraq. And in Iran, Iraq fought a very bloody war in the 80s, and that led to the death of 1 million people. And Iran wants to make sure that Iraq is never a threat to it again. And so that is what's in the minds of the Iranian leaders. So you look at many of those leaders, that was their formative experience, the Iran-Iraq war. Now Iran has benefited from the collapse of Saddam's Iraq, because Saddam's Iraq was the bulwark pushing back on Persia, on Iran. And recently, in the last few years, through the fight against ISIS, Iran was able to develop land corridors across Iraq and Syria to supply Hezbollah. It's pushing up against Israel. So you're now seeing Israel and Iran coming into conflict inside Syria. Now, the nuclear deal, I think Obama's hope with the Jcpoa was that it would just take the nukes off the table, so you wouldn't have a proliferation in the region. But Obama didn't push back on Iran's nefarious activities, whether it was the ballistic missiles or supporting all these different Shia militias. And he didn't want to push back at the time because he didn't want to undermine the chance of reaching that deal. A lot of the Republicans hated that deal. Did they hate it because what's in the deal, or did they hate it because it was Obama's deal? And for Trump, first thing, to get rid of that deal. Now Trump believes that by putting pressure on Iran, it's either going to bring Iran back to the negotiating table for a better deal, his idea of a better deal, or it's going to bring about the collapse of the regime. Now, you've been living there, but from what I'm told, Iran is not in a revolutionary moment. They're not waiting to replace the regime. And so the collapse of a regime and just nothing there afterwards would be disastrous. And the Trump administration, instead of trying to balance the region, and trying to balance Turkey, Israel, Saudi, Iran, because it all kind of got out of balance due to the Iraq war, instead of trying to balance that, he has taken the view that Iran is the enemy, the Saudis and the Israelis are the good guys. And so he's putting everything on, whether it's Mohammed bin Salman in Saudi or Netanyahu. So he's aligned himself that way. And this, obviously, what's going to happen with this pressure on Iran? How will Iran respond? I think Iran's assumption is Trump's only going to get one term. Well, I wouldn't take that as an assumption. I think Trump is quite likely to get 2 terms. So this, I think, is very dangerous. I'd much rather see an American administration backed by the West trying to create a better balance of power in the region between Saudi and Iran, trying to de-escalate the regional rivalry that plays out in Yemen, tragically, Syria, and down the Gulf. But that doesn't seem to be the way that we're heading at the moment. So I don't believe that Iran is this evil, scheming power that it's made out to be. I think it's taken advantage of because of the weakness of the Arab states. But it is problematic, and I think the potential for escalation between Israel and Iran is high. Israel calls it the war between the wars. But are we close to another war? And if war does happen, what shape will it take? That's not
Emma
happy
Skye,
note.
you raised many questions tonight, and I think judging from the very good questions from our gathering tonight, these are questions that others are also confronting in their own lives and in their own work. We're very pleased that you put W2 on your travel itinerary and came to spend some time with us. I think, thank you very much for writing another book, and it's admirable that you come with humility as well, and introspection about what it is you do and how that you do it. And I think since we started with Gramsci about the old world is dying and the new one's struggling to be born, we should end with Gramsci. And my favorite Gramsci, Antonio Gramsci quote is, of course, the optimism of the will and the pessimism of the intellect. And I think this is perhaps where we're all caught between this, our educated selves, and what comes from the heart. And perhaps I'll just leave you with one last bit of wisdom that you will find in this book. And I know you will come up and talk to Emma and get Emma to sign a book for you. When Emma was asking many of her friends from near and far what the purpose of this should be, one GP said to her, the purpose? It's just to have fun. Thank you for the fun and for the wisdom you brought us.
Thank you very much.